Here we are. And Raquel, thank you for joining us. Longtime listeners to the Polite Society podcast are going to notice this voice in just a second. Most likely are going to recognize the face, too. But Raquel Okyay, a longtime fighter for our rights, speaker this year at GRPC, and soon to be author. Talk about what you got coming out.
I wrote a book called The Progression of the SAFE Act, and it talks about the anti-gun law that was signed into law in New York State in 2013 in a big rush. And I wrote the book to tell the story from the gun rights perspective. Because if you look into the newspapers in New York State during that time, what you're going to find is stories coming from the anti-gun perspective. So what I wanted to do was put together these stories that I've already written while the SAFE Act was being passed and what happened after it was passed, the 2 years thereafter. So it comes to about 28 articles, 28 chapters. And what I wanted to do was really preserve that story that won't be told in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal because they're just simply not interviewing the same people that I did. So I'm interviewing the gun rights advocates. I'm interviewing the legislators who support gun rights. And I'm telling their story. So that's something that I wanted to preserve in history. So 50 years from now, somebody wants to know, how did the SAFE Act, and I'm going to call it the Unsafe Act, how did the SAFE Act get passed in New York within hours, overnight, and what New Yorkers did to combat that law, which is a story in itself. Because what I saw was people from all walks of life. I saw men, women, families, people from the left, from the right, from the center, and they were joined together on this Second Amendment issue. And it came to fruition about 2 weeks after the law was signed by the governor. We had a massive protest in Albany where we had over 10,000 people show up. We had busloads coming in. And when you looked out into the crowd, what you saw was everyday Americans. And like I said, they were men and women and families. And it really brought us together. And we're fighting it in the courts right now to have the SAFE Act repealed. There are some legislators who are pushing to repeal it within the state legislature, but we have big problems there because it's New York is, the legislature is controlled by anti-gun Democrats. So we have a big fight there, but we also are very confident that our case is going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court because of the narrow issue that's still sort of, that there's a problem, and that's that the states simply cannot ban firearms that are in common use, and that's what Heller, told us. So we know that these firearms that have been now, we can't use them in New York because of the SAFE Act. So what the SAFE Act did essentially was turn law-abiding citizens into criminals, and that was kind of the, what had people so upset. So
it sounds like you're writing the history on the ground versus the history of the press release and of the mainstream press, which will later be taken as history unless you document what happened.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, interesting. Here's what we saw, here's what we did versus what the elite said about us. Fascinating.
That's right. And that's coming from the people on the ground. So I'll give you an example. The night that they passed the SAFE Act, I had a state legislator, Mr. McLaughlin, calling me from Albany. It was like 10:30 p.m. And it was like, Raquel, they didn't even show us the bill. I haven't even seen it. And the Senate has already passed it. And what the governor did was, the reason why they got it passed so quickly, because in New York State, there's a 3-day rule requirement.
Right.
So the governor just said, well, this is a message of necessity.
Essentially an emergency piece of legislation with really? Meaning you can't let it, you'll have to pass it to see what's in it, to use the old quote.
Pretty much, and even the legislators didn't see it. Okay, so there was huge problems there, and the governor signed it within 30 minutes. So this was something that they wanted it turned over real quick, so they didn't want to
So that
hear.
no one could oppose it and call their legislators.
Correct. That's absolutely right.
Welcome to New York.
Yeah. Exactly. Now, if you read the stories in the mainstream, they're not telling that story. So they don't have McLaughlin on the phone like I do, telling me what's happening, and or they don't have all of the victims too. So there are scenarios where, for example, there's a veteran, an Army veteran in Long Island who went to the ER for insomnia.
Right.
Paloma is the attorney. She's supposed to speaker here. I know her. She's in my book. So in that case, he goes for insomnia. They're like, okay, here's some sleeping pills. We go home, go to sleep. And the next thing you know, he gets a call from the sheriff's office. Like, we're coming to get your guns. And he's like, what? And and he calls Scope, and he's like, oh my goodness, they're trying to take my guns. And a Paloma got involved, and they're fighting that. They're still fighting that in the courts. But basically, what happens is that the hospital, they can just arbitrarily say, well, we think this patient might have guns, and we just arbitrarily decide to call the New York State Police, and then the New York State Police goes and takes your guns. Because some medical worker decided that your insomnia might be dangerous. I mean, that is the SAFE Act. That's the ridiculousness of it.
Well, and the painful point, not only does that seem absurd, dangerous, and unjust, hi, now you get to go fight with the state using your resources to try and defend your rights.
That's absolutely right. So we're spending a lot of time and energy in fighting this SAFE Act when we could be doing, other constructive things, because New York State isn't actually, the greatest place for guns either. So we're working on a lot of things there. It kind of gets people motivated to do things, but why do we have to? It's just not fair. Money, time spent to just fight for rights that we're born with.
Can't hear you, John. No, grab.
One thing I find remarkable about your book is that it's...
He says go for the purple.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. One thing I find remarkable about your book is that really it's a contemporaneous account. It wasn't written in hindsight. It was written all along because you put 28 articles together, linked them together, and it was as you went along. And I think
That's
that
exactly
tells
right.
that tells a better story than some historian coming in 5 years later interviewing people with faulty memories.
That's right. It is. It's a continuum of January 13th and for 2 years after that. I see my writing get better.
As you get more familiar with it, when do you think it will be out? Where will people find it?
I really hope soon. So I'm hoping to get it published.
You turned her down.
I'm hoping to get published with Merrill Press and Alan Gottlieb, who has said he'd read the manuscript for me, because I kind of want to get a printed book. I want to go like old school publishing. I want a hardcover. I want a printed book. I want that my readers could take home. They could save it. Their kids could read it. It'll go in the library. And 50 years from now, somebody can go back and they can say, this is what happened, how the SAFE Act got passed. Not what you're reading in the mainstream.
And not what comes up at the top of the Google search.
That's right.
Here's the truth.
That's right. Here's the truth. So I'm hoping it's going to be out by the end of the year, and I'm going to work really hard to get it out as soon as possible. Yeah.
We're running out of time here, Raquel. We got a couple other guests, but thank you again for coming on and telling us about the book, and thank you for speaking at the conference this week.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. And of course, I know Paul a long time, and I used to co-host with him on a gun show.
Yep.
When Polite Society, and I'm so happy and proud of you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Raquel
Paul.
Okyay, everybody. Raquel Okyay. Look for that book coming out, and we're going to have her on again when it comes up, when it comes out for sale. We'll be having her on again. We're going to be moving.